We are privileged this morning to be joined by Dr. the Honorable Ngozi Okonjo Iweala, the Minister of Finance of Nigeria, as our keynote speaker for the opening working session of today's conference. Dr. the Honorable Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala was appointed in July 2011 as the Minister of Finance for the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Prior to this appointment, she was Managing Director at the World Bank from 2007 to 2011 and has also held the position of Minister of Finance and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nigeria between 2003 and 2006. So she has been shuttling between Washington, D.C. and Nigeria over the past few years. She's notable for being the first woman to hold either of these positions. She holds a PhD in Regional Economics and Development from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and is an AB graduate of Harvard University. I have had the distinct pleasure of hearing her speak a few years ago in Trinidad. And believe you me, you're in for a real treat this morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in giving a warm Cayman Islands and Caribbean welcome to Dr. the Honorable Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. It's very energizing to see that there are so many people who have turned up so early in the morning. The Honorable Minister of Finance of the Cayman Islands, the Honorable Marco Archer, President Bowden, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and I see students and faculty also, and other distinguished guests. In Nigeria, we say all protocols observed, but before I do that, I want to acknowledge the presence of a very dear friend of mine, the head of Transparency International, Huguette Labelle. Lovely to see you here. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure that I stand before you today to honor an invitation that has been long in the making from the president of this university college to deliver this keynote speech today. The Cayman Islands is a long way away from Nigeria, and so it was a very interesting decision, I should say, to convince my president that I should come and deliver this lecture so far away from home. But two things happened. I managed to convince him that, you know, the diaspora is all one with us, and that any time we have a chance to come and dialogue with each other and share experiences, we should do that. And secondly, I cleverly managed to bundle this with a couple of other commitments in North America. So that's why I'm here today, and I must say I feel very, very welcome. Thank you. I feel all the more welcome because since I've come, I don't know how many people have stopped me and said, "We love your movies." And it looks like a lot of people watch Nigerian movies. And it's always intriguing to me. I'm going to rush home and give them that information because I don't watch them very often. So this is a big encouragement to the third largest movie industry in the world called Nollywood. Now, the issue of corruption, which is the subject that you're tackling in this very good conference, is never an easy subject to talk about, let alone to tackle. But this conference on Ridding the Caribbean of Corruption on Ethics, Values, and Morality is yet another testament that this little university that could is indeed making giant strides towards the development of the Caribbean region by putting on the plate important subjects that need dialogue, discussion, and action. And I want to commend President Biden and his team for their very good work. Yes, please go ahead and clap. It deserves a round of applause. Let me start by saying that, as we all know, corruption's debilitating effects are felt across the globe. Although I'll be talking to you particularly about experiences in Nigeria and the lessons we learned that we may be applicable here. But corruption is a global phenomenon that contributes to enhancing poverty instead of reducing it, and hampering overall economic development, particularly in developing countries, and perhaps to a lesser extent also in more advanced economies. As many of you know, my country, Nigeria, has also suffered heavily over the decades from the ills of corrupt practices. But we have not stood still. We have fought these practices, and I'm here to share with you the experiences and the lessons we've learned as we have gone along. But before that, let me just mention a number of ways, and I'm sure that Huguette has also talked about this, in which corruption rears its head in the world today, and ways in which we experience it, not just from domestic actions, but also internationally. The first one I want to mention is the issue of transfer pricing and tax evasion, which I'm sure, being from the Cayman Islands here, you hear a lot about. And this occurs mainly through exports over invoicing from our side of this equation, and the circumvention of taxes by global companies. Please note that I'm not talking about the legal tax deductions or taking advantage of loopholes in laws that are perfectly legal. That's not what I'm talking about. If they exist and companies take advantage of them, that is legal. It's not a problem. What I'm talking about is illegal activities by companies that are undertaken deliberately and which rob us in the developing world of a lot of the resources that we need for our development. And it's important to talk about this because people often think of corruption with regard to the public sector alone. I know in many of our countries, when we think corruption, our mind immediately jumps to the public sector. But corruption is not peculiar to the public sector. It's rampant in many aspects of the private sector, and that has a very serious impact. And I'll give you examples of private sector-led corruption, which has impacted us in a very difficult way. Many large companies are guilty of transfer pricing and tax evasion. And in fact, it is the single biggest form of illicit money flows from developing nations to developed ones, representing between 60 and 65% of total flows, according to Global Financial Integrity, the Washington-based think tank. We have bribery and theft, which occurs when public servants, yes, now we're in the public sector, demand payment under the table for rendering a service, or when a state or country's budgetary resources are illegally diverted through inflated contracts that are siphoned off abroad or at home by policymakers and civil servants. In Nigeria, you know, those that indulge in this kind of bad activity are called, in quotes, evil servants. According to the OECD, more than $1 trillion is paid each year in bribes to public officials in both developed and advanced countries in exchange for advantages in international business. Just think about that. These are large numbers indeed. Then there's the corrupt theft of natural resources, which might not be familiar to you, but occurs in many of our countries on the African continent, when a country's mineral and oil wealth is brazenly stolen and illegally sold for gain. This has been rampant in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm sure you all have heard about or seen the movies about blood diamonds from Sierra Leone and Liberia, which has cost these countries significant amount of resources. In Nigeria, for example, we have been experiencing significant revenue shortfalls in recent years as a result of oil theft and pipeline vandalism. Nigeria is one of the largest oil economies in the world, and we are losing about 100,000 barrels of oil per day to theft from onshore and swamp operations alone. Now, when people tap these pipelines by breaking into them using dynamite and so on, the pipelines are shut down, and they could be carrying up to 150,000 barrels. And what happens is it's not just the amount that is stolen, that is lost to the treasury, but the total amount being carried by these pipelines. And in 2013, we experienced a loss of output of 300 to 400,000 barrels a day through this mechanism. And if you add up the revenue loss, we are losing about $1 billion a month. So about $12 billion lost in revenues through this oil theft and pipeline vandalism. Now, this theft is carried out in collusion with corrupt individuals, some of them, I'm sure in high places, inside the country, colluding with those outside. And the crude oil is often siphoned off to be refined in refineries in Africa, Europe, and as far away as the Americas. And increasingly, it is so lucrative that mafia elements are getting involved in this very nefarious activity. But it is up to us in our country to take the first steps in trying to tackle this action. And as I speak, we have a task force set up by the President of Nigeria with many governors of the states in which this activity is taking place. I'm a member, trying to work with the military, the police, and other elements of the security forces to tackle this problem. And lastly, we have the proceeds of drugs and narcotics trade, counterfeiting, racketeering, contraband, and other forms of crime, which account for about a third of global illicit flows. All in all, the cross-border flow of the global proceeds from criminal activities, corruption, and tax evasion is estimated at between $1 to $1.6 trillion annually, again, according to the work of Global Financial Integrity, of whose board I'm a member, by the way, full disclosure. The developing countries lost about $946 billion in illicit financial flows in 2011 alone, representing roughly 10 times the amount of official development assistance flowing in from the advanced countries to support struggling economies. Total outflows over the decade from 2002 to 2011 amounted to about US $5.9 trillion. Now, these numbers are so large, it's very difficult to get your arms around them. But these are huge numbers indeed. To show you that corruption is pervasive, a recent EU report puts the cost of corruption in the EU at about 120 billion euros annually. So it's not just in developing countries that we have this problem, but the EU, this was just about 3 weeks ago, they put up this figure. That is, cost of corruption in the EU is 120 billion euros annually. In sub-Saharan Africa, the resource drain over the past 30 years is almost equivalent to the region's current GDP of about 1.5 trillion. So you can imagine how corrupt practices constitute a major drag on the continent's development, that is sub-Saharan Africa's development. In fact, African finance ministers have been so concerned that we did something which I'm quite proud of. We got together and we set up a high-level panel to look into this matter. It's chaired by former South African President Thabo Mbeki, and a team was put together with the help of NEPAD and the AU to look at illicit flows and how to curb them. We judge that if we have these kinds of monies flowing out of our continent and we could stop it, there's no need for us to be looking for aid from anyone because we could use our own resources to develop ourselves. And we've actually put it down as one means of innovative financing. Since we're looking for new ways to tap resources, we're saying to developed countries, now, if you work with us to try to curb these flows and return the monies, this is another way you can finance us with our monies, and you don't have to use your taxpayers' monies to support us. So this panel is working, and immediately I return. Nigeria is, in fact, hosting this year's meeting of African finance ministers and planning ministers and central bank governors. And Thabo Mbeki, President Thabo Mbeki will be there to give us an update on this issue and how we can act in order to get hold of our own resources. So having just given you a general picture of the various ways in which corrupt practices and illegal resource flows affect us, let me now turn to the case of my own country. Just for those of you who may not know, but this is a university community, so I'm sure you know, so forgive me if I bore you. But Nigeria is one of the most interesting countries to work on in the world today. I must tell you that. It is also one of the most complex and one of the most difficult. It's a large country with 170 million people and with over 374 different languages. And I'm talking languages, not dialects. The economy is driven largely by oil, but is increasingly diversifying and doing relatively well. And it has been growing at about 7% per annum over the past decade. In fact, Nigeria is one of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world today, according to IMF statistics. Our fiscal deficit is 1.9% of GDP, again, one of the lowest in the world today. Our debt to GDP ratio is 21%, so we have debt relatively under control, but we are not sanguine because we are accumulating domestic debt at a relatively high level. And one of the things I'm working on now is trying to slow down. People believe that if it's domestic, it doesn't matter. And I often tell them, no, it's actually the opposite because you can't afford to owe your own institutions. So we are working to slow that down. But overall, our debt to GDP ratio at 21%, again, is one of the lowest worldwide. If you think of what we have now in the US at over 70%, in Europe over 100, in Japan over 200, then you know that this is not a bad place to be. Inflation is about 8%, and the exchange rate is relatively stable, and we've got foreign exchange reserves of about 40 billion, equivalent to almost 6 months of import, according to IMF statistics. So we have a relatively stable macroeconomy, but more interestingly, we have great potential in terms of non-oil resources. Agriculture is probably the best and the easiest for us to diversify. We used to be one of the largest exporters of agricultural products in the 60s. But when we found oil, we forgot all that. And, our agriculture sector and all the other non-oil sectors suffered. So we are going back now to basics to be able to feed ourselves. We are using only 40% of our arable land, and so we have a great potential. Housing, we just launched a housing revolution. The President Goodluck Ebele Jonathan, is determined to use these sectors to create jobs for young people. And so that's another area. Creative industries, we just talked about the movie industry. And this movie industry we have in Nigeria has created about 200,000 direct jobs, 1 million indirect jobs, and is worth $250 million in value, and has great potential to grow. So those are some of the areas that we are looking at. Now, Nigeria is regarded as one of the new frontier nations by Jim O'Neill. Jim O'Neill is the Goldman Sachs economist who created the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, Indonesia, and China, the emerging market group that had made such a mark on the world. And now he's come up with the next group that he thinks are going to be the key emerging countries in the world. And he's called it MINT, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. And it's very exciting. He sees these as the next group of emerging countries. And in fact, the MINT countries are trying to get together and see what this means in terms of their place in the globe. So this is a bit of the background of Nigeria, just to situate you. And Nigeria, by 2050, will be the 4th largest country in the world by 2050, according to projections, overtaking the US in terms of population and so on. Very soon, we will finish rebasing our economy. Economists know that every 5 years, you should really look at the structure of your economy and see whether you've captured all the dynamics. We've not rebased the economy since 1990, and in 2 weeks' time, we should have the results of this rebasing. We are the second largest economy in Africa now, but I'm not going to tell you the secret, but we're expecting a little bit of a change in that situation. So all in all, Nigeria is a country to be reckoned with, and I'm privileged to be able to be the finance minister of this very dynamic country. So why am I telling you all this? Is for you to get an idea of what we're talking about, because one of the key problems that we've had plaguing the country over the years, and very much linked to the fact of the natural resource economy of oil, has been corruption. And estimates vary about how much we've lost in corruption over these decades, but some figures put it at about 300 billion in the past 3 to 4 decades. And much of this was under military rule, because Nigeria has also, for the past 40 years, been largely under military rule, and it was only in 1999 that we returned the country to the democracy that it had in the 1960s. That's a whole different story. So a lot of not so good stories on the corruption front, particularly in these days of dictatorship, but also continuing today. And what I'd like to do is give you some examples of the bribery and corruption, how it's been debilitating our development, and then more importantly, what we have done and are doing to fight this curse. I've written quite a bit about this in my book, Reforming the Unreformable, which I have here. It's from MIT Press or Amazon, you can get it. And I'll take 1 or 2 examples from there, but also share with you some contemporary examples. Now, we have different types of corruption in the country, and I'm just going to give you those related to the economy that we can quantify, but even in the education sector and so on, we've had problems. Now, the one that you would have heard about recently is the one related to corrupt money stolen by some of our dictators and exported abroad to Europe and North America. I'm sure that maybe a couple of weeks ago you heard and saw an announcement by the US government of $458 million in corrupt assets belonging to a former dictator, Abacha, who was in office from 1993 to 1998. And his exploits are still following us today. It's estimated that during his 5 years, about 3 to 5 billion of our public assets were taken by this, by Abacha, by this military ruler, and exported out of the country and hidden in various parts of the globe. To put this in perspective, the money exported is certainly more than the entire GDP of the Cayman Islands and that of several other Caribbean islands as well. Now, looked at from this perspective, when you think about this 3 to 5 billion, using World Bank unit estimates, this money could have provided antiretroviral therapy for 2 to 3 million people infected with HIV/AIDS over a 10-year period, or supplied insecticide-treated bed nets for over 200 million pregnant women and children as well in Nigeria and in our African countries. So this helps you to see the damage that this kind of theft of public resources does. It takes away monies that could help pregnant women, that could help children, that could help build infrastructure. And the money was siphoned off through a series of shell companies and perfectly legitimate banks. Some of them, some well-known banks globally that we have today. And I'm sorry to say that in our work, tracing it, we traced $20 million then to banks here in the Cayman Islands. So this is one of the things. Now, since I'm going to talk about my country, I hope you won't mind also if I point out a few things to do with the Caribbean and the Cayman Islands where there are also problems. But I actually have a diagram in this book where we traced some of the monies, and $20 million was traced here. So he had money in Switzerland was the biggest place where this money was stashed. And, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, all over the place. So, and I'll talk a bit later about what we've done to try and get these monies back. We've also had a number of corruption cases in which foreign companies, some of them quite well known like Siemens, paid bribes running into millions of dollars to Nigerian officials to facilitate the award of government contracts. And the cost of these are inflated contracts and contract terms that are not in the country's best interest. In fact, it was so bad in 1999 that a World Bank country assessment of Nigeria's entire procurement system revealed that out of every dollar spent by government at that time, 60 cents was lost to corrupt practices. Such was the predicament we were in, and we had to take serious action. And I'll tell you what we did. More recently, we've faced a number of serious challenges. Our oil subsidy program, we export crude oil, but we have 4 refineries that are not functioning very well, so we have to import some of our refined oil. To make matters more complex, we subsidize this oil, the price of it at the pump, so that Nigerians can get it at a very inexpensive price. This is done by many countries. And so we opened up the import of this to many companies. I was quite shocked. Before I was in government the first time from 2003 to 2006 as finance minister and foreign affairs minister. And by the time I left government, we had a subsidy bill of about $1.6 billion. When I came back in 2011, our subsidy bill had risen to $16 billion. Huge increase and half of the federal government's budget. And claims were being made on about 60 million liters of fuel imported into the country per day when the actual daily consumption was much less than this, maybe about 40 million liters, which tells you the huge amount of fraud that was in the system. And the number of people importing this fuel, including some briefcase importers, those not really registered but collecting money, had risen to 140 from much fewer than that, I think 20 or 30 earlier on by 2011. So that will show you we're talking large amounts of money here and in this kind of fraud. We've also had problems with our fertilizer subsidy regime. We have this policy program of subsidizing fertilizers and inputs for small farmers. But the government was distributing this to the farmers. And of course, you had middlemen and others who entered into it, and we found that much of the fertilizer was diverted and sold off in the black market, and only 11% of registered farmers were actually getting this government-subsidized fertilizer. Another example, our public service, plagued with several ills. We had the ill of ghost workers. In government, civil servants and others entering people into the payroll that didn't exist and somehow managing to collect their salaries. In work we did, we found that we had up to 45,000 ghost workers that had been entered into the service. And in fact, some of these ghost workers graduated to become ghost pensioners. And people were still collecting this corrupt money. That's to tell you how far difficult. Even in our education system, we didn't also escape because rot and corruption began to pervade what was probably one of the best education systems after colonial rule. In fact, we also had the best civil service because people used to petition Nigeria to send civil servants to their countries to help them develop. In our education system, you found bad practices, students, colluding with professors to cheat on exams. So, sadly enough, teachers or professors asking for favors, monetary and non-monetary, of students, particularly young women, being asked to do things so that they could pass exams. This is also a form of corruption that is very pernicious. So, and of late, you may have heard of our oil company and some of the questions that have arisen of unaccounted for monies within the oil company, which we're struggling with, much exaggerated in what you've heard. But this, again, raises the specter of what is going on in the country. So you can see that I've not spared, Nigeria. I've been very frank with you to tell you the sorts of ills that have been pervading the society and I think built up over time. But everybody has challenges and ills. I think the key question for us is, what did you do about it? And what are you doing about it? Because as I often say, no one can fight corruption for a country except the citizens of that country. And you have to get in, you have to pull up your sleeves, you have to be brave, and you have to fight. So I want to share with you the various ways in which we also tackled these issues of corruption within the country. Our fight against corruption took off after the return of democracy in 1999. On the realization of the huge drain on resources that corruption had become, the then President Obasanjo, created two key institutions: the Independent Corrupt Practices Commission, ICPC, which was set up in September 2000 to investigate and prosecute offenders in cases of corruption in public life, and the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, EFCC, in April 2003 to investigate financial crimes in the private and public sector. These two organizations were very active and are still very active in prosecuting high-profile cases of corruption. And the number of government officials in the mid-2000s, never before questioned, were arrested, tried, and jailed for corrupt practices. For the first time ever in our history, we had an Inspector General of Police who had been siphoning off, the pay of policemen, this ghost worker syndrome, but actually even pay of working police. He was investigated by the EFCC under Nuhu Ribadu, one of our brave young people, and found guilty. He was tried and sentenced to jail. This had never before happened in Nigeria, and it sent shockwaves within the country. We had state governors investigated, impeached. In this book, I have a discussion of one of the impeachment processes where a state governor who was found corrupt was thrown out. We had ministers, permanent secretaries, people brought to book in a show that impunity does not work in the country. In fact, the issue now for us in Nigeria is that people feel that these organizations need to be much more active, and the government now needs to be more proactive about continuing this spate of arrests. Now, for the first time with these institutions in the 2000s and today, the government was able to show commitment to fighting corruption and in curbing anti-corruption practices in public and private life. Some, of course, felt when the arrests were made, as you will in any country, that these were politically motivated and done to witch hunt enemies. And of course, political interference in such institutions is not good. However, what I say is corruption, wherever it is found, and should be dealt with, and we should not bring politics into it. But I would say that when you have such institutions, it is good if they can operate relatively independently, such as the case of the ombudsman in South Africa. If you listen to the news, you would have heard that the president of South Africa, President Zuma, has just been asked to return some monies that he used for his private house by the ombudsman in South Africa, who is very independent and not beholden to anyone, and can therefore bring in an oversight even over the president of the country. So these kinds of institutions are very helpful. And we found that they've been able to help us in showing that impunity does not work. Now, what about the issue of the Abacha monies? What did we do? With strong political will and significant international pressure, we went after monies looted from the Nigerian treasury by Abacha, his associates, and others. As I said, much of it was stashed away in the UK, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and right here in the Cayman Islands. It's been a hard fight over 15 years, using expert Swiss lawyers. And we're still at it. It's not over. We have had support from the lawyers, as I said, And we've also had support from the evolving legislation internationally, like the UN UNCAC, the United Nations Convention on Anti-Corruption, and the OECD conventions have given us the international moral background to be able to do this work. We've also had help from the World Bank's Stolen Asset Recovery Program, known as STAR, which I had the privilege of setting up in the World Bank during my time there to help developing countries recover their assets from developed countries. We've recovered, during my time as finance minister in 2003 to 2006, we recovered about 500 million from Switzerland. And Switzerland is fast changing in terms of its keeping of these monies, much more willing to be open, to disclose, and to send these monies back. We've recovered a total of 2.5 billion of these Abacha monies, which is a lot. And we have our sights on $1 billion that is still out there, of which I mentioned to you that 458 million has been frozen by the US in various jurisdictions. But we also know that we have over 200 million in Liechtenstein and a similar amount in Luxembourg. And when you add all of what we know about right now, that's another $1 billion, which we are determined to recover. Now, on the problem of inflated contracts, what did we do? We instituted a process of reviewing government contracts after we got the World Bank report. We didn't have the process of competitive bidding before, and that's what made it so difficult. So since 1999, we instituted what we call the due process mechanism, a system of local and international competitive bidding. And we created an office called the Bureau for Public Procurement, which now oversees contracts, particularly large ones. And with the work of this institution, we saved an estimated 2.5 billion of public resources that would have gone out of the window if we had not had this process in place. So that's an institution we've built to tackle this problem. On the fertilizer fraud, what have we done? We introduced a new system. Our new Minister of Agriculture, Dr. Adesina, who used to work with the Rockefeller Foundation, came in and completely threw out the government system of procurement and decided that the private sector can handle this, but through an interesting program, through the use of technology. And we introduced what we call the Growth Enhancement Support Scheme that enables private suppliers of fertilizer, even in the rural areas where you sell Coca-Cola and soap and other supplies, you can also sell fertilizer directly to farmers through an electronic wallet or e-wallet system. So now you know that Nigeria is one of the fastest growing mobile telephony markets in the world with over 120 million mobile phones. So we can now phone our farmers a voucher, which they now take to the dealer and buy their fertilizer, and the dealer goes and collects the amount from the bank. That way we've completely taken out middlemen and others and revamped the system, and it's working. Guess what? Over 70% of our farmers are now getting access to this fertilizer instead of 11%. So that's another revolution that we've done. On the petroleum subsidy regime, we've started a series of reforms that are in fact difficult. I don't know how many of you remember at the beginning of 2012, where we had a very difficult time because we tried to roll back the petroleum subsidy. How many of you saw on television, on CNN for about a week? Yeah, you did. You saw people who were demonstrating. That's why governments are afraid sometimes to tamper with these kinds of subsidies. Once you put a subsidy in, it's one of the most difficult things to roll back. So we wanted to completely do away with the subsidy. But with the demonstration, I really want to say that the president was very brave because it was a very tough time. He hung on, but what he did is we rolled it back by 50% instead of completely, as we were planning to do. And with that, we were able to pull back about $6 billion, which we are now using to do what? We are using it to improve maternal health services because Nigeria has maternal mortality indicators that are not very good. One of the bad was the really not good ones in the world. So we've improved our maternal mortality by using this money to offer conditional cash transfers to pregnant women. If they come in for prenatal care, antenatal care, they get a cash transfer. of about $5 to $10, depending on where they are. If they come in for an attended birth, they get another cash transfer with their husbands. And if they bring their baby in for the required immunization, they get another cash transfer. So we're deploying this money for much better use than for subsidizing petroleum, much of which the poor people in the country didn't really get. It's richer people who get these subsidies because they are the ones that drive cars. It's not that the poor people don't get, but they get much less of it. So I'm very proud of this, but we still have about 50% subsidy on this petroleum. So how to roll that back is a very tough subject in Nigeria. And I'm sure if the Nigerian press were here today, even mentioning the word rollback subsidy would get a big headline. Finance minister says. So I'm glad that this is not the case. It's a very political issue, and you know, we're in an election year, so this may not be the time. But if we could do it, it would put money into other things which are needed by poor people within the population. We've also cleaned up the petroleum subsidy regime for our private marketers, those who were coming and defrauding the government. We've completely rolled back the number of these marketers that we're bringing in oil from 140 to 48. We've put in a series of verification processes through my ministry and the Ministry of Petroleum Resources. And as a result, we've been able to cut back considerably on the amount of subsidy payments that are being made. And we've put these things in place in an institutionalized fashion so that they can be enduring. I think our big problem now remains with completing the reforms with our state oil company, where there's still, Nigerians feel a lot of lack of transparency. But we have the instrument to do that. You know, in the petroleum industries bill, a bill that is with our parliament now, and they need to pass as quickly as possible, because it would commercialize the oil company and force it to open up its books. There's even a plan to privatize 30% or more of its shares to let ordinary Nigerians buy it. You know, if you commercialize and privatize, it opens it up more, and then it can be more accountable to Nigerians. Now, on the issue of ghost workers and ghost pensioners, we have built institutions and introduced the use of technology. We are using biometrics to enroll every single one of our civil servants. We are about halfway through the civil service. And as I said, so far in our work, which has been ongoing for the past couple of years, we've weeded out 46,000 ghost workers and saved about $800 million that was being lost through this fraud. So biometrics is what we are using. Everybody has to come in and have their fingerprints and so on taken. And the same with the pensioners. So that way, we are able to use technology to help build a system that can curb corruption. And I'm very excited about that. We are also transforming our financial services through electronic platforms that will enable us to do things in a more modern fashion. In addition to all this, now I'm saying all of this, you know, and it all sounds very easy and tame. It's not been. For each single reform that we've done, you've had to fight vested interests. Fighting corruption is a very tough thing to do. And it can be life-threatening. I know, I can tell you, because last Christmas, Christmas of 2012, my mother was kidnapped for 5 days by the group of those people who did not want us to clean up the oil subsidy fraud. And they told her, she just turned 84, an 83-year-old woman. She asked, why are you holding me? And they said, all we want is for your daughter to stop her work on the oil subsidy, to get up, to resign and leave the country immediately and go back outside to Washington. So my mother was held for that reason. And you can get threats to your life. So fighting corruption is not easy because, as my friend Nuhu Ribadu says, corruption fights back. But should you give up? The answer is no. If you love your country, if you want your young people to have a future, if you want them to know that honesty pays, there have to be people who are willing to stand up and fight. And this is what we have to do in our countries, because we do not want to give in to those elements that undermine our development, our rob our young people of the future. So I just want you to know that as I'm giving this speech, I'm making it all sound as if it's simple. It is not simple. You need dedicated men and women. It's not just me. You need the political will. In every work I've done on fighting corruption, I've never been told by the president or anybody to stop. But you actually need the people. We don't need armchair critics in corruption. We need people who are ready to roll up their sleeves and fight. And for that reason, I also want to commend Transparency International for the international support that they give to people who are engaged in this endeavor. Now, in addition to all this fight against corruption, I want to say that we have endeavored to introduce as much transparency as we can in the way we do business. That is why when our central bank governor recently made allegations of missing monies, the first thing we did was to say we have to have a forensic audit, independently managed, so that Nigerians can know, because the numbers I have that are unaccounted for are vastly different from the ones that he put out. And it's also interesting that he didn't have a conversation with me, the Minister of Finance, first, before putting those numbers out. But the only thing that can help us is more transparency, and that is having a forensic audit to see what is actually happening with the oil company. We've tried to model what we believe in terms of transparency. We introduced the monthly publication of revenue allocations for each tier of our government, because Nigerians are very suspicious of what happens to their money. So every single month, I forgot to bring a copy for you to see, we publish all the figures of revenues for local government, state government, and the federal government, so that everyone knows that this month my local government got this in revenues. My state government and governor got that. And the federal government got this to do its work. And that has been causing a revolution. It's leading people to ask questions. So when a local government chair says we can't pay teachers' salaries, primary school teachers, people say no. Where is the money? Because in this publication, we saw that you got X hundreds of thousands of dollars this month, equivalent. X million of naira, that's our money. So where has it gone? So transparency can be a powerful tool to engage the public in asking questions of their policymakers, and I'm very pleased. Of course, some other people were not pleased that these numbers were being published, but you have to press on and do what you need to do. Our budget is also quite transparent. The budget is so detailed. I've not seen that, and working at the World Bank, I've had experience in almost 100 countries. The type of detail we publish the Nigerian budget enables people to see how much is used in State House to feed the first family, how much they used to buy forks and knives. And if you go on the internet and look at Nigerian social media, you'll see them asking questions. So why are you spending so much money, on feeding yourselves in the villa? That's what we call our State House. Why are you buying a new set of plates? And then they're very critical. And I have to remind them that this is unusual, that we should be proud of ourselves, that you are able to ask questions about the use of money, even if you criticize where it's going. But if you didn't have this information, you would not be able to ask. And in many countries, you don't have it. So this is one of the things that we've put in place and we're doing that I'm very proud of. If you go on the internet, you will see that our budget is on our budget website of our budget office. So many other things that we publish. Any waivers or exemptions that we give companies, any benefits, we also publish that so that people can see what we're doing with the private sector and ask questions. I believe strongly that if you couple fighting corruption with making transparent as many of your transactions as you can, that is a really good way in order to curb corruption and bring honesty. So these are some of the things that we've done. My last point on this is to tell you that one of the things I've discovered as we go along is that the key to fighting corruption, which we often forget, is building institutions. The difference between developing and developed countries in terms of this corruption fight is the absence of institutions or the weakness of existing ones or the misapplication of institutions that are there. We often do not have institutions. What do I mean? So for instance, if you get those who are engaging in oil fraud, but you do not set a new system in place for handling that, a new set of people will come. And because the loopholes are there, what will they do? They might be tempted to repeat the same things. So you must put in place systems, processes, and institutions that will block, to the maximum extent possible, people's ability to be corrupt. It's not that people in developed countries are any more honest. They are not. It is that they built these institutions to help block, and they put incentives and disincentives in place to make sure that they limit corruption. Now, you know, having shared these experiences with you, let me just say one or two more things. The nature of corruption varies across country. We've noticed that in sub-Saharan Africa, we may be on what I call the supply side of corrupt flows. Monies flow out from us, but there are countries that are on the demand side of these flows. And these are countries that either promote a safe and secure haven where these flows can come in, or provide very safe opportunities for investment. And I think here in the Caribbean, you may be on the demand side of this corruption because people see security and a haven, quote unquote, in many of the places here in which they can bring both licit and illicit flows. So we need to think about what this means if you're on the demand side of corruption. Analysis from the Boston Consulting Group shows that outside Europe, the Caribbean region is the largest offshore financial center of the world. You know that already, with offshore wealth amounting to nearly US $1 trillion, equivalent to about 12% of global offshore wealth at the time. And the Cayman Islands is an example of one of the world's leading offshore financial centers, or tax-neutral jurisdictions, as you like to be called. You dominate the global market for investment and hedge funds. And the IMF estimates that nearly 3/4 of flows to the Caribbean offshore centers finds a home right here in the Cayman Islands, while the remaining quarter goes to Barbados, Bermuda, Belize, the Bahamas, and the Netherlands Antilles. Now, I know that much of the development of the financial industry in the region is due to commendable efforts of the various governments in combating corruption and improving transparency. I know that the Organization of American States, Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, addresses this issue of corruption here and has long been ratified by several Caribbean countries. And the mechanism for follow-up on the implementation of the Inter-American Convention has recorded significant progress in many of your countries, regardless of existing implementation challenges. I also know that the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, which is an agreement by 29 states and territories here in the Caribbean to implement countermeasures against money laundering and terrorism financing, is also very active. And I want to commend you for all these efforts you've made in combating money laundering and in trying to improve transparency. Here in the Cayman Islands, the anti-corruption law, which came into effect in 2010, has brought the island in line with international obligations under the OECD Convention and UNCAC. And I know that last year, the OECD lauded the Cayman Islands for its robust and transparent legal and regulatory regime. You're also taking steps here to stem tax evasion by adopting new rules and regulations to reduce secrecy, such as your 2013 Tax Evasion Pact with the US, which requires you to tell the US Internal Revenue Service about American offshore accounts worth more than $50,000. So whilst you've done all of this, it's very, very commendable. There still seems to be a specter of suspicion, or at least perception, about what goes on in the Caribbean. I just want to quote you two quick studies that we need to think about. In its just released 2014 International Narcotics Control Strategy Report, the U.S. State Department has named several Caribbean countries, including the Cayman Islands, as major money laundering states whose financial institutions engage in laundering proceeds from international narcotics trafficking. And according to another report by the UN Office of Drug Control, UNODC, net inflow of cocaine-related funds into the Caribbean would amount to some $6 billion, equivalent to 2.3% of the region's GDP. So in other words, whilst you're struggling really to do as much as you can to be open and transparent, it looks like the perception, and maybe the fact, is that you're not quite there yet. And that there are critical issues that you yourself have to reflect about in the nature of the business that you do here as an offshore financial center. So the key question, I think, for you in the Caribbean and for the Cayman is, where do we go with this economy? Is this what we are going to focus on in the future? If yes, and we built this along with good tourism potential, how do we manage to keep the flows that come into the country and the region licit? And how do we curb the flow of illicit finances and corrupt finances that can come in? I know that these are questions you reflect on every day, but you do have to reflect on them because the studies that are coming in, where on the one hand, you're being praised for what you're doing to be more open, but on the other hand, there's still a question mark about the complete openness and honesty in receiving some of these illicit flows. So these are questions that I want you to think about. How do you continue in the future to be the kind of financial center you are, but manage to use the means and mechanisms at hand to curb the inflow of illicit funds, some of which come into your jurisdictions? And then there's a second question. It's not just enough to talk about the tools we use and the efforts we must make to think of how to deal with illicit transactions. This conference is also talking about values and morals. And that's the second question we need to ask ourselves. What are the values, morals that underpin the kind of business done here and the kind of businesses and the kind of economies we run in our own countries? Morality is about rationally right ways of behaving in society. And as far as the distinction between good and evil, right or wrong is concerned, corruption is morally wrong. But this again depends on our values. Corruption breeds a value system that elevates gain, whether material or non-material, above everything. It destroys integrity and character. And gone are the days when individuals' selflessness, courage and integrity and moral uprightness were appreciated and rewarded. Nowadays, in many developing countries, what is looked at first is material wealth. So the issue for us is, are we having the kind of conversations about our values, our moral systems, our way of being and behaving that underpin the kind of business that we do in our countries and the kind of future that we want our children to have? Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, once said that good habits formed at youth make all the difference. And C.S. Lewis, the famous Irish writer, also said, education without values, as useful as it is, seems to make man a more clever evil. So we really have to think of what underpins our value system and our education system as we look into the future of the kind of economies we want and the kind of tools we need to fight the pervasiveness of corruption. Religion is also important. And I often tell people, coming from a country in which religion is so important, particularly fundamentalist evangelical religion and also Islam. We're about 50-50, 50% Muslim, 50% Christian. And I often tell people that I see a lot of religion, but with little religiosity. We have to think about that, because that also speaks to the fundamental of what we teach our children and what we put forward as a platform in which to handle the issue of corruption. So, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, to sum up, I don't know if we'll ever have a corruption-free world. I don't think so. I don't think we'll ever have a total corruption-free world in either Nigeria or the Caribbean. But I can tell you that a combination of real-life tools coupled with enduring and supportive value systems can make a huge difference in the fight against corruption. Where there's political will, where there are brave men and women willing to fight, where there's a drive to build institutions and apply them properly, corruption can, should, and will be fought. This should be coupled with strong incentives and disincentives to underpin behavior. And for you in the Caribbean and the Cayman Islands in particular, perhaps fighting corruption and stemming the demand for illicit flows may also scare away some legitimate businesses. So there may be a direct price to be paid. But you have to take the chance. You have to take the chance to get it right. Because I saw a very nice saying in my hotel room last night, which I'm sure you all know, from Christopher Columbus. The one that says that you can never cross an ocean unless you have courage to lose sight of the shores. That is what we must all do, ladies and gentlemen. We must have the courage to set sail on this ship of anti-corruption. We must have the moral rectitude and the courage to fight. If we do that, we can promise our young people a world of values, a world of value-laden business, a future that they can look forward to. Let's join hands, ladies and gentlemen, in the fight against corruption. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Protocol having been established. First of all, let us put our hands together again for that wonderful speech. Let me say thank you to Mr. Sam Rose, the Cabinet Secretary, who stood in for me this morning. And unfortunately, I'm newly elected, so therefore, I'm not that well known. So when I arrived this morning, the security guard sent me in one direction. And I was watching Madame Ngozi enter the room. And I'm saying, I should be there now. And he's sending me in that direction. So my sincere apologies for that. But without further delay, we're going to open it up now to questions and answers. So please feel free to stand and ask any question that you may have, or anything that this speech may have done for you in terms of awakening your thoughts as to how we go about tackling corruption or ensuring that we put an end to it before it actually becomes anything of great consequence. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hello, morning. Afra Raymond from Trinidad and Tobago. I was very intrigued in January 2009 with the collapse of the commercial banks, some of the leading commercial banks in Nigeria, and the decisive action taken by the then governor of the central bank, Lamido Sanusi, in order to recapitalize the banks, restore stability to the financial sector in Nigeria, and also to prevent the shareholders of the banks benefiting from the government recapitalization, and in fact, to interrogate the officials of those banks in terms of what went wrong. And I wanted to get an update from you, Madam Minister, Madam Ngozi, Excellency, whether you could let us know how that process has unfolded, because we had a similar scenario in Trinidad and Tobago in January 2009, and we just crossed the 5-year mark. And I'd like to get an update from you about your 5-year mark. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Well, let me take that whilst others are warming up. Thank you. You seem to know quite a lot. Yes, during the height of the financial crisis, which was another form of corruption that I didn't really get into, that led us, led the globe to where it was, you know. But I have to tell you my joke that I think if we had had Lehman sisters instead of Lehman brothers, we might not have been where we are. But yes, Governor Sanusi did a very good job in intervening. I was at the World Bank at the time as managing director #2 at the bank, and I was privileged to see the devastation this was doing to countries. But he quickly moved in. Nigeria had two advantages. One, we had this cushion of funds in the excess crude in our savings from oil, about 22 billion at the time that we could draw on. Secondly, we had a governor who took decisive action on the financial sector. And what he did, I think, was painful in the sense of, closing down the activities of certain banks, throwing the owners and the managing directors running them into jail, and seizing their assets. And creating what he did that I want to update you on is that he created what we would call a bad bank. And you know that this is a common tool that is used in several countries. Were used in Sweden in the 90s for their crisis, in Malaysia when I worked there in the late 90s in their financial crisis. A bad bank takes all the non-performing loans out of the banking system and lodges them somewhere, cleaning out the banking system and enabling it to move forward. In effect, when you do that, the government ends up recapitalizing, using taxpayers' money to clean up and recapitalize those banks so that they can start again. Because the financial sector, the banking sector, is too important to the integrity of a country. So that's what Lamido did at the time, and created an organization called AMCON, Nigeria's Bad Bank, and using government bonds, of up to about 5 trillion naira in our system to clean out and lodge them. So the bad bank is working well. What has happened is that it's been able to resolve many of these bad assets because it has time to go into it and manage, and has recovered up to 1 trillion naira, about 15 billion, about $6.7 billion of that money, and intends to continue to recover and pay back that money. He also did something interesting. He said all the banks should pay a certain percentage, 0.5% of their, assets, revenue, into a fund to help resolve this situation. That's ongoing. They don't like it, but it's happening. So together, that money they are paying, it's a unique feature in Nigeria, together with the recoveries being made from some of those bad loans, that's helping to pay the taxpayer back and resolve the situation. Now, the banking system is strong. Non-performing loans are at about 5%, one of the lowest in the world. The banks are well capitalized, and things are going well. There are about 2 more banks that had to be taken out. The state took over and is actually re-privatizing them and selling them now. But by and large, we have a very strong banking system, and we are very, very happy and proud that that's the case. Now, they're not doing everything we want because we feel that interest rates are too high for the real sector, and they're not giving as many loans to spur real activities as we would like. But one thing is sure, we have a solid banking sector today. Thank you. Okay.
Good morning, Dr. Iweala. My name is Rachel. I very much enjoyed your presentation, and I have two questions for you. One, what do you think is the correlation between cultural diversity within a nation and corruption? For example, yesterday, they were speaking about the fact that Nordic countries, which are pretty homogenous, have very low corruption figures, while a country which you've pointed out, like Nigeria, which has 300 and something languages, has a difficulty with addressing with large-scale corruption. How much is that a factor related to the need for state capture on the part of ethnic minorities or that kind of thing? How much does that feed into corruption? And my second question is, for developing countries, isn't it easier to entertain illicit funding than it is to, say, get development funding from a bank or from the World Bank? For example, the figures indicate that World Bank financing for development has some 67 conditions on average for poor countries, with Ghana having faced 197 conditionalities in accessing their funding. Quite frankly, a cocaine dealer is not going to ask you to do anything when they're giving you their money. So the difference is between 67 or more conditions as opposed to opening a bank account and going about your business. Thank you.
Yeah, you've asked, thank you very much, a very tough question in saying, does cultural diversity make for corruption? And is it easier, you know, where people are more or less the same? Let me give you a two-part answer. Let's put it this way. I strongly believe that the issue is not about the cultural diversity, but it's about having strong institutions in place. That even if you have a very diverse country, but you have those rules, regulations, that supervisory oversight, you know, and you couple it with acting against impunity. In other words, when people act, they get punished. If you put all this together, that you're likely to get the same reaction from human beings. Like I said to you before, I don't think that there's anything that predisposes one set of people to be less corrupt than the other. You will notice that behavior, you know, in the absence of rules, you can't see any diversity or color. People behave the same. If there's no rule to guide them, they will act in their natural instinct. And, you know, I just want to use an example that is not about corruption, but I was in London, traveling for the World Bank when the 9/11 happened. And it was a very unusual situation. And my husband was telling me that he had never seen such chaos in Washington ever. You see, when an unusual situation occurred that had no rules around it, human beings behaved in their natural, self. And everybody came out at the same time. Traffic was snarled for hours and hours and hours. All rules were thrown to the winds. So when you don't have any institutions or systems governing a process, human beings, whether they are black, white, they have this language or language will behave. So that's my fundamental belief, because I've seen it done, that places where people thought, oh, this place is lost, when you came in with the rules, people actually behaved accordingly, because if they didn't, they were punished. If they did, they got rewards. That being said, there is no doubt that where you have a lot of diversity, you may have more suspicion. Where people don't speak the same languages, for example, like in my country, it takes a longer time to mold the nation. You understand? You know, there may be more suspicion in a more diverse group. You know, but that is just an observation, because diversity can also bring strength. And we actually believe that it's more of the latter. So I'm one of those who don't believe that it's truly because we are so diverse and we have so many languages. I actually think it's fun, because you have very different people coming at things. But it is because we, as a modern state, have not built those rules, institutions, and processes, and we have not exhibited and even applied the ones we built strongly enough. And that, to me, makes the difference. And I'll just do my Swiss test, which is, how many of you know who is the president of Switzerland? How many people here know? No one. And yet, people rush to put their money in Switzerland. Is that not true? Don't they rush to do business there? Why is that? You don't need to know the people who are running the country. You don't need to know anyone. It's because Switzerland has put in place such strong institutions that it doesn't really matter. People have built up trust based on that. And I think this is what we need to aim for, to build strong institutions in our countries. Sorry, I've taken a bit of time with that because it's a tricky question. You know, on the surface, yes, you know, the more diversity, the less trust, the more corruption. But if you think about it deeply, you have a lot of diversity in the U.S. as well, don't you? The U.S. is a country that has been accepting immigrants over time. Of course, they've tried to mold everyone into a U.S. culture, but ostensibly beneath the surface, there have been different sorts of people coming in. But over time, they've managed to curb problems of corruption, problems with the mafia, problems with, all those problems existed there. It's not that they didn't exist, by building institutions and making them work. Now, on the issue of the funding from the World Bank and so on, you know, I think the idea, I'm no longer at the bank, so I'm not holding brief. And inside the bank, I was at the top. I think I rose actually in the bank because I was so critical of our processes, our inner processes. And you know, I had the privilege to go and come back and go, so I could bring real-world examples. So I'm not holding brief, but I also do think that the image of the bank that people have is an old one, that the institution has really evolved and tried to change, and they have many instruments now that do not have this list. It was in the 80s and 90s that they had these lists of conditionalities. So I'm not saying they don't require a country to do certain things, but it's not that former approach, because otherwise it doesn't work. You understand? This is one of the critiques that I had. If a country is not committed into doing certain things right, there are no sets of, the minute, you know, you have all those conditions, they might just pay lip service to it, and when you leave, they revert back to the things that they used to do. So it's ownership of a reform process by a country that counts. So because of that, they've much lessened the number of conditions, and they have instruments that can disburse money fairly quickly. That being said, they do a thorough job of analysis before they give a loan, and so it takes them a bit more time than if you, as you said, walked up to a bank and then just borrowed the money. But just think of what else the bank brings. You know, it brings knowledge of what is happening in other countries. You know, the kind of knowledge that can help you learn and do things better for your country if you work with them.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, let us put our hands together for Dr. Ngozi.